Hundreds of millions of dollars in war reparations for the DRC. The UN's top court orders Uganda pay compensation for its role in displacement, death, rape, and recruitment of child soldiers. Is it justice for the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the minimum price to pay for war? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the DRC's reparation ruling. The International Court of Justice has ordered Uganda pay $325 million in reparations to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The court decided Uganda was responsible for thousands of deaths and displacements, as well as other crimes over the course of its 5-year involvement in conflict in Eastern DRC. Kampala has called the ruling unfair and wrong. Still, it's now expected to pay 5 yearly installments of $65 million each, starting in September. The amount was just a fraction of the $11 billion demanded by Kinshasa. Judges at the UN court said the DRC had failed to show evidence that Uganda was directly responsible for more than 15,000 deaths from 1999 to 2003. The court also dismissed several claims, including broad compensation for macroeconomic damage, saying a clear link between Uganda's actions and alleged economic damage was not shown.
The court is satisfied that the total sum awarded and the terms of the payment remain within the capacity of Uganda to pay. Therefore, the court does not need to consider the question whether, in determining the amount of compensation, account should be taken of the financial burden imposed on the responsible state, given its economic condition.
But there were opposing views in the court, with some arguing the monetary award does too little to compensate the people who suffered.
In terms of human toll, ecological toll, everything that concerns a form of destruction, this amount cannot cover the reparation as expected by the Congolese people, in view of all the damage that Uganda has had to perpetrate on Congolese territory.
Well, the ruling brought an end to Kinshasa's legal battle with Kampala that started over 2 decades ago. Let's take a look. The DRC first brought the case before the UN court in June of 1999, citing acts of armed aggression perpetrated by Uganda on its territory. The ensuing conflict in the DRC's Ituri province is estimated to have killed more than 50,000 people and displaced 500,000 others. Uganda denied responsibility, claiming its troops were invited in. But in 2005, the court ruled Uganda was an occupying power that was obligated to pay reparations to the DRC for violating international law. The two sides, however, couldn't reach an agreement on their own. So, a decade later, the DRC took the case back to the International Court of Justice for a final decision on monetary compensation. The Ugandan government rejected the DRC's demand for more than $11 billion, calling it dangerously disproportionate and an amount that would ruin its economy.
Some of us still have the shrapnel in our bodies. Some also need prosthesis. Compensation money will help us a lot. That would allow us to put our kids through school, to look after our mothers who lost everything, and to comfort some who were paralyzed.
All our dead brothers and sisters are still waiting. But even if they could give compensation to the whole city of Kisangani, that won't bring back to life all our brothers, all our sisters who died.
So do international courts provide victims with the best hope for justice? Well, founded after World War II, the ICJ is just one of several courts at The Hague in the Netherlands. In contrast with the International Criminal Court, which tries individuals for crimes against humanity, the ICJ rules on disputes between countries. The Republic of the Gambia opened a landmark case against Myanmar for genocide. In some instances, the UN has established criminal courts with specific jurisdiction, like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The ICTY jailed former Bosnian Serb commander Ratko Mladic for life for committing genocide 10 years after he was captured. Now, defenders of these systems of international justice argue the judgments are impartial And even though justice may be delayed, it is eventually delivered. But detractors say that delivery is too little, far too late. So is the ICJ's ruling on reparations for the DRC fair? And what precedent might it set for similar cases going forward? Well, joining me now to discuss that and more from Uganda's capital, Kampala, is Allana Kembabazi. She is a program manager at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Before that, she was a law clerk at the Constitutional Court of South Africa and a fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Michael Becker joins us from County Carlow, Ireland. He was a legal officer at the International Court of Justice and is now an assistant professor of law at Trinity College, Dublin. And in Oslo is Stig Jarle Hansen, a political scientist and international relations professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences with expertise on East Africa. Thanks all so much for being with us. Michael, let me begin with you. This $325 million might sound like a big, broad number, but it really is just a tiny fraction of that $11 billion Kinshasa was after. Still, though, is it a victory for the DRC, and did the court do its job?
I think there's no question that it's a victory. $325 million is a lot more than zero, which is one possible outcome of the case. So the DRC is that much better off. But you're absolutely right. It's far less than what the DRC put forward in its submissions, which amounted to more than $11 billion US. I think that's an amount that the DRC and its legal counsel could never have expected to actually be awarded. So there's a certain amount of gamesmanship here in terms of what you request and what you put forward. Did the court do its job? This is an extremely complicated case. The decision on the merits, as is well known, was made many years ago in 2005, and it's taken a long period of negotiation between the parties, which ultimately failed before the matter came back to the court for this separate reparations phase to go forward. I think under the circumstances, complicated questions of causation, how much of the damages that DRC put forward can actually be attributed to the actions or omissions of Uganda. These are really complicated legal questions, and it's early days. I think there's a lot more to analyze and unpack and study about the court's judgment. But the court, I think, has made a very serious effort to do this in a relatively transparent and clear way. Okay. So yes, the court did its job, but ultimately it's a kind of partial justice, I would say.
Right. I mean, it is not a simple case. And Allana has said that this ruling is unfair and wrong. So tell me, do you think Uganda will actually make that first $65 million payment that's due in September?
Yeah, I didn't say it was unfair and wrong. I actually agree with the ruling. I think it's hard for us. Like he said before, the decision on merits was made many years ago. But our Attorney General has said that it is unfair. And it raises very, like you point out, whether or not they'll actually make the payment. I mean, $65 million due September. That would require the current budget process, which is ongoing for the next financial year, to take this into account, which it has not. We're also at a time when there's a lot of demands on the state, especially at a time when we're trying to recover from COVID-19 economically, which has really had devastating impacts on us. So it does remain to be seen. I know that Uganda and the DRC right now, again, are in a joint intervention around the ADF, and it will be interesting to see if the politics there enable them either to, and they've also been trying to build roads in the DRC, whether or not the politics there will enable them to be able to maybe think of creative ways to pay this back. But from the Attorney General's statement today, Uganda seems to even be denying culpability. And it does acknowledge that the amount asked for is much less, but still maintains that this is an unfair decision. As a human rights advocate, I think we have to also remember that there were violations here. Before Uganda's issue was there were other people there This was settled in the Kinshasa Accord, which the court had actually dealt with. And as a human rights advocate, you have to ask yourself, are you coming forth with clean hands? Because we are right now in the DRC, and a lot of us are concerned. We're saying, listen, we know what happened in the past. And ultimately, it's the taxpayer that bears the brunt, like we will have to do. So when you undertake certain decisions, right now they're in the DRC without parliamentary approval. So when you go to these countries without the approval of the people, commit human rights violations, and we have to pay. We cannot then begin saying this is completely unfair. I hope at minimum that the impact of this will require government to be more intentional about scrutinizing whether or not it needs to undertake certain operations, seeking parliamentary approval, and also ultimately being responsible. One of the things that the government noted was that, listen, you say the UPDF, so it was not Uganda's official policy to carry out these human rights and international humanitarian law abuses, which is, I think, just like the court said years ago, which is kind of strange because the UPDF is controlled by, the actions of the UPDF can be attributed to Uganda. So I would say it remains to be seen. It seems unlikely that they will want to comply with the tone of the content out today.
And that's the issue. I mean, here's this ruling, but Michael, I'm going to come back to you for 1 second. Stig, I want to come to you in just a second about another issue. But Michael, on the legal perspective here, what mechanisms are actually in place to ensure that this ruling is carried out and that money is paid? And what are the consequences if it doesn't get paid?
Well, this is a classic dilemma of international justice. The enforcement mechanisms are relatively weak. And so if Uganda were to decide simply not to pay, it would require political will from other actors to take steps to make that happen. So whether that means withholding funds from Uganda in totally unrelated channels, excluding Uganda from other positions that it might have in the international community. It would depend on third states, not really the DRC, coming in and telling Uganda, you need to live up to your obligation here under the court's judgment, or else you're going to suffer some other kind of penalty. The court, very interesting in the judgment, the court, the DRC had specifically asked the court to keep this case on the docket until the amounts are paid. And the court declined that request, rejected it, said that we don't think that that's necessary, and that's not how we normally do things. And there are understandable reasons for that, but I think the unique circumstances of this case, in terms of the types of cases the ICJ normally deals with, might have called for a different approach by the court in terms of trying to stay involved or setting up some kind of mechanism that would essentially put pressure on a continuing basis on Uganda to pay the amount. Okay. But to the one just last point on that, I know you wanted to move on, but it is true that the brunt of this payment, if it's made, is going to fall on people in Uganda who personally bear no responsibility in the vast majority of cases for anything that happened in this conflict 20 plus years ago. Right. And that's just another problem or kind of something that's very unsatisfactory about this outcome, even though it's a measure of justice for the DRC.
Indeed. And then even beyond that, Michael, just quickly, I mean, if this money is indeed paid, will it get to the victims? You know, if it has to make its way through sometimes corrupt, infrastructure and bureaucratic structures to get to the victims themselves?
Well, the DRC has told the court that it would set up a special fund to manage the payments to try to alleviate those types of concerns, to make sure that the funds do go to victims and survivors of the underlying offenses. But I think it will probably fall on civil society to try to hold the DRC to that commitment as well. Okay.
Stig, let me turn to you. Generally, I mean, are you comfortable with this ruling? Is it fair, given what happened?
I think it's very hard to trace the specific details from that period of time. But on the other hand, I'm quite happy about the verdict, because it sets a kind of precedence when it comes to this involvement in other countries. There has been a lot of proxy games in the past in the region that caused a lot of harm. Proxy games in the sense that one state support a non-state armed actor in another state, and it wasted a lot of money, both in East Africa and the more Central African states. So this actually shows that the world cares about this, and it's kind of sets a precedence, although you face all of the dilemmas that the previous speakers have touched upon. So it's not an easy verdict to make, but I actually view this as a positive first step to reduce this kind of politics dynamics that some of the Eastern African and Central African states have been too easily playing in the past, although it's the ordinary population who suffered for it.
Right. When you talk about precedents, though, Stig, does a precedent set in this case specifically open the doors, to other prosecutions, potentially even, I don't know, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, whom many see as responsible for thousands of deaths in the 1990s in the DRC as well? Does it open the floodgates, in a sense, for a lot of other cases to go forward?
I think it's at least a small opening here, and I think it's an important opening. It's a mess to untangle, that's true, but it's a mess that maybe we have to untangle because we have to prevent similar dynamics to happen in the future in some way or another. These countries cannot simply afford to engage in such power politics. There has been step forward, though, since, of course, this war was going on. So there are more regional cooperation today, and when it comes to security, but we need to avoid these politics dynamics with the authoritarian leaders who kind of play games that they cannot really afford, that hurts the local population. So I actually hope it opens up a little bit those floodgates, and that can lead to court verdicts in other cases with the other countries that intervened in Congo and even beyond Congo.
Okay. Michael, I'm going to come to you in just a second because I want to ask more about, processes in the future. But Stig, please tell me, because Allana was alluding to the ADF, and I think that needs to be explained in this context. Ugandan troops are still very active in the DRC today, reportedly, rooting out terrorists along with Congolese forces there that have, they're saying that these ADF forces, Allied Defense Forces, have launched attacks, the Allied Democratic Forces have launched attacks in Uganda, and that those forces may have links to potentially Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. So yes, a common enemy for Uganda and the DRC, but how are they cooperating on the ground right now with this brutal recent history behind them? And doesn't it kind of blur the lines of responsibility in everything that's happening here?
You know what's interesting here, and I have to touch upon that, is that the International Court today is punishing the type of behavior that led to ADF in the first place. ADF was a creation of the then Zairian government, Mobutu and Bashir in Sudan, to launch against Uganda. So it was a part of this power play that was played between authoritarian leaders in the region that made the local population suffer. So it's basically traceable back to some of these events that we are talking about in the 90s here. Today, as you say, there has been increasing cooperation also because ADF is perhaps strongest in the Congo, but we've seen a tendency over the last 2 years where they launched more attacks inside Uganda. So it's a kind of need for those parties to cooperate, and Congo doesn't have the proper means to handle it, not even United Nations. And that's a step forward, but the distrust from 20 years ago is still there and hamper this cooperation. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories in the region. And of course, ADF is still standing on both of its feet, and it's slowly but steady slided towards the Islamic State. Today, we will know that it has Islamic State sympathies and possibly also got some money from them.
Okay. Allana, quickly, I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a cautionary tale. When Uganda first went to the DRC, they had a good relationship with Kabila. And if you look at the time, they decided at some point in August, he decided that the countries should leave. And he singles out Rwanda, and Uganda thinks it's just Rwanda and stays there, right? And then the DRC turns against and says, no, you violated all of this. You basically, you're challenging us to rate all of that. And that makes me think about how quickly things can change. So right now we are there, and one of the things that stood out was Uganda called it a joint offensive or something. The DRC didn't use strong language. Again, it's a cautionary tale that if you're going there at the invitation of the state, there should be something that shows, come to Parliament, set it all out, protect yourself, because things change really fast. I know that right now, and this affects whether or not this decision is enforced. Because right now, Uganda and DRC are purportedly working together to challenge the ADF. I think there'll be less, some have argued there may be less pressure to push for its enforcement. I don't think that, and again, this because you have, as presidents change, as relationships change, all those other social political considerations do affect the enforcement of judgments like this. Right. But I still find it very shocking that Uganda is saying we challenge and reject. I'm like, no, the decision on the merits was made years ago. This is really about how much you owe. But the Attorney General's statement following this today was very clear that they're challenging and rejecting, and they feel like the UPDF is being singled out. And also whether or not other countries then push as hard as they can for the enforcement of this. Because if you do have a country that is arguably playing a stabilizing role of some sort, sometimes they just don't come at you. Right. The fact that Rwanda has left, the DRC discontinued against Rwanda, and that is their whole thing. We were many players, you only chose us, and yet we are still the ones doing the brunt work. So it makes it harder to enforce. Those other social political considerations make it harder to enforce judgments like this. But I think at minimum, everyone is very angry about the fact that we have to pay.
Right. I mean, it all gets so convoluted trying to carry out, verdicts like these and carry out justice when others will face injustice for things that they had nothing to do with. But Michael, let me come back to you, because when we talk about precedents, and other parties potentially following suit in the future based on, rulings we're seeing now, tell me, do you think these cases, I mean, how much are they worth fighting? How much does it cost a country like the DRC just to go to court, and for Uganda, to defend itself when it needs to? Are these processes prohibitively onerous and expensive, or is it really worth it in the end?
Well, there's a few questions there. So I think bringing a case or defending a case, an ICJ type case, so a case between states, it's expensive, but I think in the grand scheme of things, even though it might cost millions of dollars to prosecute a case over several years, it ultimately is not an insurmountable sum, and there are, in some cases, funds available to help some states bring actions. So I don't see that as a huge factor. In terms of the precedent here, there will be important things from this judgment this week in terms of how you calculate damages or how you figure out attribute cause to a state in these complex situations of war and involving mass violations of human rights. So it will be important in that sense. In terms of kind of opening the floodgates or a precedent for other cases to take place, I don't really see that happening because of this case. Ultimately, you can only bring a case seeking the kinds of damages that the DRC sought here if there's a court that has jurisdiction. And the ICJ happened to have jurisdiction in this case because of the particular circumstances and the states involved. But there's a reason that the DRC hasn't been able to bring parallel actions against other states because the ICJ wouldn't have jurisdiction. So there's a question of opportunity here, which is separate from the kind of legal precedent that's been set by the court finding not only that violations took place, but that Uganda could be held responsible and have to pay these reparations as this compensation as reparation.
Okay, Stig, I can see you agreeing and disagreeing at the same time. I can give you 1 minute for your final thoughts. Go ahead.
Yes, definitively, because there are definitively legal particularities of this case. But the thing is, you have established a principle, and I think this principle needs to be enforced in the future and become stronger, because this might be cases in the future also that this verdict concerns. We need to stop these power games. And then this is a small step in the right direction, setting a small precedence that at least somebody is watching if you do these things in regional power struggles.
Okay. Stig, you will have the final word. I'd like to thank really all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Fascinating conversation here on The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.